wesleygospel.com. Welcome to wesleygospel.com. I just finished the sixth and final chapter of The American Myth of Success. Oh, I'm sorry, seventh. The American Myth of Success by Richard Weiss. What an accomplishment of, scholarship, this book. Um, there's aspects about it that are kind of repetitive and redundant, but he's covering so much material. You can tell this guy just literally filled up a personal library of books on success literature, um, mainly spanning the 1800s and 1900s, um, but 200 years worth of success ideology being analyzed, synthesized. It's quite a read. Um, but so, what are my takeaways from this last chapter? This last chapter was on self-help. Okay, so the self-help group is still New Thought, but it's more watered down. It's a more watered down form of New Thought because self-help kind of emerged after the hardcore mystics of New Thought kind of died off. Um, and so what you had was basically modern psychology or modern psychotherapy being turned into what you call pop psychology, um, or just, books that were from the common person that were in general agreement with psychiatric principles to keep people emotionally healthy. The sorts of things a psychiatrist would tell a person in therapy sessions were put into these books to help people cope, like I said, mental and emotional coping mechanisms with the anxieties of the workplace. And so that's what self-help literature was about. And success was not, in these self-help books, it was not defined in terms of financial amounts. So if that's what you're looking for here, you're looking in the wrong place. But sooner or later, you're going to get little crumb snatches, and you'll get enough hints of how to find those amounts. Uh, but the technicalities of success literature um, were really mainly focused on a general recommendation of encouraging people, giving people a sense of courage in the face of adversity, encouraging positive thinking despite the negative and bleak circumstances that surround you. And that is really where the book leaves off. And so you had basically people borrowing mind over matter ideas when it came to sickness, extremely negative situation, right? So we're going to use mind over matter, tell ourselves that we're not really sick, and hypnotize ourselves and suggest to ourselves that we're healthy thinking. Think upon the healthiness, what it would be like, what it is like, what it already is like, right? And you think yourself in to an emotionally healthy state of mind, and as a result of that, you become healthier. All right. So the mind over matter people came in, and that affected mental health healing, mental healers, hypnotherapists, and then that also affected the Holiness Pentecostal tradition as well with divine healing. It wasn't just about praying for healing. Now it was about the mind over matter element. You already are healed in the first place. And so that got blended in to divine, which is heretical. It's a heretical concept because James 5 doesn't teach mind over matter. It teaches the prayer of faith, which is, you receive revelation from the Holy Spirit and you command healing with faith in Jesus' name, which is the power of the Holy Spirit at work through that. It's a totally different method of physical healing in James chapter 5. But mind over matter psychiatric therapy of encouraging positive and happy thoughts got mixed in with a lot of holiness Pentecostal teaching on divine healing, coming from New Thought. Um, it's the idea that I am healed, I am healthy, I am perfectly healthy, even though you have cancer and you're suffering from chemotherapy. You're telling yourself that you're already healthy. Like this mantra of I am healthy does not come from Pentecostalism. It came from New Thought and was imported into Pentecostalism through books and through teachers. Okay, anyway, so this mind over matter group, and this might sound like a side trail, but this stuff got mixed into success literature and the self-help. Anything that caused anxiety was to be avoided. Okay, this included alcohol, gambling, poker, stocks, coffee, tea, tobacco, because those are addictive. And if you have withdrawals, that's anxiety. Drugs of any types, headache powders, sleeping medicines, if you withdraw from them, you get withdrawals and anxiety, right? So anything that caused it anxiety was to be avoided. Um, in the self-help literature, okay? Holistic view of success, not just money, but psychology, mind, body, and spirit, mind, body, soul. And yes, the body part does involve money, but we're really talking about people working in heartless corporations and learning how to cope. And that's the general message of success was very generalized. All right. Fear and anxiety of working in the heartless corporation was still there. People losing their sense of identity and independence in the heartless corporation, becoming overwhelmed by fear and anxiety of working in these oppressive environments. So what did self-help do? Self-help gave you ways of thinking as you went to work, ways of thinking that were optimistic, positive, coping mechanisms. Here's a quote here, page 214. Uh, as the classic rags to riches literature waned, a mentalistic success literature arose to take its place. The new teachers of how to succeed drew more from psychology than from religion, and techniques of healthy habit formation replaced the earlier moralists' exhortatory calls to virtue. Right? So self-help was not Puritan work ethic. Self-help was not The Religious Tradesman by Richard Steele, where honest hard work combined with prudence and frugality leads to wealth as you have faith in God's providence and go about your business activities. That was the Puritan idea. Self-help wasn't about that. Self-help was psychology applied to the corporation worker. That's self-help. See, self-help is the confused New Ager working for Darth Vader in the Death Star. Okay, the Death Star represents the heartless corporation. Darth Vader represents the CEO, who only cares about money and power. And so you have, the worker bees, who are basically cogs in this massive institution, who, like the stability that comes from receiving those wages. But they oftentimes find that the workplace is psychologically distressing. And so what did they do? They turned to self-help books to help them cope with this extremely negative situation. And they could find no way out. They found they looked around and they saw no way out of it. And so the self-help books helped them to cope. It's actually very sad when you think about what's going on here. Especially in light of the message that the Puritans had given out, which was, be free, be free, work for yourself, and trust the Lord in that process. Um, there was a practical book that became very popular that was self-help, but also talked about stuff like writing business letters and practical stuff. It was Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. But most of the self-help books weren't like that. They were mostly psychotherapeutic and aimed at helping people have good attitudes. I think that probably, in light of what we're talking about here, probably one of the best things that is more biblically grounded would be Larry Burkett's book, Business by the Book, which is basically going to be a small business manual with practical advice and providing biblical support. I haven't read that book, studied it, but I plan on it. And, you know, as far as a small business success manual, that would be the best one that I could look to. It's called Business by the Book by Larry Burkett. Now, in this last chapter, he actually does occasionally refer to self-help, new thought people, encouraging people that are already moving into self-employment, starting their own business. And so you'll occasionally find references to them providing them a sense of health, wealth, and happiness, not only in actuality, not only in theory, but in practice. All right. And that was the self-help going back to the original vision, which was 100 years before, which was start your own business and then you'll be healthy and wealthy. Uh, this conflict over whether to work in the Heartless Corporation, this tension of whether to work in the Heartless Corporation or to be happy and work for yourself is there in this chapter. It's there. And when we're talking about success, this is the spectrum we're working with. You've got the 1099 contractor or the sole proprietor over here, who's the ideal. He's the happy guy. He's the success. He's the traditional vision of success. And then you got the guy who's just trying to hang in there. He's working in this heartless corporation, and he's trying to keep a positive attitude, but he finds himself in a compromised situation. The most popular person in the self-help category was Norman Vincent Peale. He wrote a book that was published called The Power of Positive Thinking that came out in 1952. And from what I can understand, he was somewhat orthodox. He had sort of an old Puritan biblical economic attitude. He would refer to the Bible sometimes, but he was clearly influenced by liberalism, liberal Methodist. He denied original sin. So I mean, but that's extremely heretical. He basically said at one point, he said, whether you are prepared to admit it or not, you are a good person, basically. What? That's totally heretical. But other than that, I'm not gonna, say that everything the man said was wrong, and so don't listen to him. He was very popular. He was the most popular in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. For Christians to look to. I mean, before Larry Burkett, it was Norman Vincent Peale. He had radio shows, he had TV shows, publications galore. So that whole element of the Protestant work ethic was revived through him. And then when he died, it seems that Larry Burkett picked up the torch. And then when Larry Burkett died, it seems that Dave Ramsey picked up the torch. But The Power of Positive Thinking might actually be a pretty decent book to read someday. and review it. But it does have this element of new thought mixed in. So it's not like it's not like on the the same level as Richard Steele's The Religious Tradesman. Not I would take that book way more seriously and to heart. But the power of positive thinking was a combination. He didn't he didn't just talk about this in reference to people who are working in companies. It was mainly that people who are working in large heartless corporations, working in companies, one job onlyism. But he also seemed to have room for people that were moving in the direction of self-employing and stuff like this. So, uh, but there was this tension. So I'm going to read this thing, uh, page 230. The metamorphosis of the self-help ideology from rags to riches to think your way to success was, as we have noted, a response to the crisis of individualism that accompanied America's emergence as a modern industrial state. As men became cogs in complex organizational structures, their sense of personal significance diminished. The increasing concern for individual power reflected anxiety over the loss of it. So the anxiety of being a W-2 employee in a corporation is the problem. Self-help was the answer. Coping mechanisms through positive ways of looking at life. You just change your point of view, change your attitude, right? However, when you go down a little bit further to page 231, um, he says this: the cult of success must be understood in terms of its symbolic significance. What gives it force is its confirmation of the individual's power over his destiny rather than its promise of material goods. So long as the ideal of individualism continues to command devotion, some means of obscuring contradicting realities is likely to remain. Actual social conditions, of course, force compromises with the ideal. Ideology, however, is susceptible of the distortion which permits perception to conform to the purity of desire. Mentalism allows what reality often denies. And so, in other words, you're saying people lose their individuality when they work in a corporation. The longer you're there, the more you are like a drone bee in a beehive. And sometimes people are called corporate drones. The longer and longer they're in there, they lose their personality, their humor. They become robotic. They lose their individual self, their sense of individuality, the thing that makes them unique, the person that God made them. And they become like 1984. No, we don't living necessarily in a communist country, but it is Marxist. It is almost like working in a communist country where everybody's the same, everybody's wearing the same uniform. There's no personal sense of self-expression going on. So people are losing their individuality. Self-help helps to obscure these contradicting realities and hold on to the vision of the individual, even though everybody else is preaching conformity. So, everybody's saying, lose your music, lose your movies, lose everything that you loved as a kid growing up and identified with, become a cog in the corporate machine, lose your personhood. Self-help said, no. Self-help said, remain an individual. Don't lose that. Jesus said, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? And I think that can mean two things. Number one, it could lose your soul by going to hell because you compromise your Christian principles in order to get along with everybody at work. But it could also mean lose your individuality because the corporate setup is an environment of conformity. You got to conform and be like everyone else. Self-help understands that the ideal is working for yourself. Self-employment, small business owner, 1099 contractor, sole proprietor, whatever you want to call it, that's the ideal because that's how you get to have individualism. There was a book called Aspects of the Rise of Economic Individualism, which I haven't read yet, but it's a criticism of Max Weber, and I think is basically a study of the Puritans once again. So they called what the Puritan tradesmen did with economic individualism. Right? You're working for yourself. It's you and your wife and maybe your son or a daughter, and that's your employees. All right, that's individualism. You're not part of a corporation. Losing your freedom and your individuality. See, the Puritans were persecuted by the large corporation called the Church of England. So they early on came to distrust large established organizations and institutions. They were very individualistic. So, but as the corporation took hold in the 1900s in America, we had almost a Church of England situation again. And uh, individualism that the Puritans experienced was uplifting and truly a life of joy to them. They took great joy in being independent. But if you're not in that, you're working in a corporation, you're working in a company, you're what they call a wage slave, a W-2 employee, and that is a compromise with the ideal. The ideal being, well, ideally, it'd be nice to work at home and be my own self-employed 1099 contractor person. But I'm not there yet. So I guess for now, I'm just going to have to compromise with the ideal. I guess I'm going to have to work with this company. And in the meanwhile, I'll maintain a positive attitude. So this is the sort of tension, the tug of war, the mental tug of war, and the emotional tug of war that the self-help books were dealing with. Hints and clues were given, start your own business if you really want to be happy. But if you're not ready for that, well, the next best thing is try to maintain a positive attitude while you're still working in really, let's be frank, a really bleak, situation. Norman Vincent Peale's book Positive Thinking was very, very popular. I mean, in the 60s and 50s, he had an incredible influence on American business people. So that's it. That's success ideology in a nutshell. Uh, the whole thing is, dude, Charles Ingalls, Little House on the Prairie, and those other guys, those other characters in Little House on the Prairie. You had the guy who was the shop owner. Sure, he had a nasty wife, but Olson's Mercantile, he had his own shop. Then you had the mill owner, the guy who was at the mill. He had his own mill. Um, and then Charles Ingalls, he had his own little tiny itty bitty little farm. That was his business. But his farm was not a very reliable business, not like Olson's Mercantile was. His farm was subject to all sorts of problems, weather problems and stuff. So sometimes Charles would have to give up on that dream of independence and travel around and try to get jobs somewhere else. But it was always his farm that gave him that groundwork of independence. The farm business was the ideal. If you could pull that off, you don't have to deal with nasty customers. It's just you and the land. It's like the penultimate independence. The only time you ever have to deal with people is when you have to go and sell product. That's it. But so if you really want to get a sense of what the American myth of success was, at least in the Christian era, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. It's Little House on the Prairie. That's what the message of this book really is. It's Little House on the Prairie. That is the success ideology turned into a TV show. Charles Ingalls is the self-employed Christian success picture. Um, um, and as I've seen every single episode of Little House on the Prairie, and I've watched several of them several times. And I can tell you, he wasn't 100% on the up and up all the time. In fact, he had ups and downs. And people who deal with discouragement and stuff like that understand that these men need encouragement too. But more than that, they need faith in God and in His providence to carry them through those low points. Because they need courage too to continue what they're doing as small business owners. Being self-employed, you need courage, but you need faith and you need courage. You do, you really do. But let me just tell you, in my experience, the past 3 years, there's less of that. There's less to worry about in that area than there is with all the emotional and spiritual warfare issues you have when you work in an office. It's a plenitude of vices that you're coming up against when you're in an office. Like I've said before, not only fear of losing your job, but lust issues with people and constant profanity and competition issues. It's just okay, how many bad things can you list, right? But when you're at home, that bad things that can you list thing gets diminished down to maybe one thing. Well, I hope I don't lose this project before I can get another one. That's about it. I mean, and that's really honestly, I mean, if you're good with marketing and you're on top of things, you can kind of control that. And then, of course, also have your wife work another job, so she becomes another source of security for you. So there's things that you can do to offset. And the idea of battle for survival, the battle for economic survival is still there. It's just that you have a lot less things to worry about when you're self-employed. So anyway, God bless you out there. This is John with WesleyGospel.com.